Well, good morning, everyone. It's been a couple days since we visited. We wanted to give you a heads up about the major things going on in the Minnesota House of Representatives today. First, we will be taking up a concurrence from the Senate to extend the COVID-19 Minnesota Fund. It's important that we have those general fund dollars available to the administration so they can act really quickly to buy personal protective equipment and machinery like ventilators. They've used that money for a variety of purposes made necessary by the emergency. I mean, some of the things that we couldn't have foreseen with the shutdown of the pork processing plants and having to react to that on an emergency basis. So it's critically important, though we can't foresee the uses they will need it for, that the administration has continued access to general fund dollars to respond quickly at this time of public health emergency. The extension will go until December 30th. It does not add new money, but we'll take that bill up first. There'll be a concurrence from the Senate. The second thing that's happening in the House today is Chair Mary Murphy is presenting her bonding bill in the Ways and Means Committee right now. And as you know, Chair Murphy wanted a bill that was much larger. There's significant unmet need in our communities, but she has trimmed down the bill. And this bill will be proceeding through the Minnesota House. We expect a floor vote on Saturday. Very important that at this time, while we're dealing with the pandemic and while we are dealing with the coronavirus and this emergency that we didn't expect, that we continue to do the work that the people of Minnesota sent us to the state capitol to do. And the bonding bill is our significant work in year 2. And so Chair Murphy's done a great job putting together a fantastic bill that we look forward to taking up on Saturday. And then finally, this morning we're announcing we'll be appointing a select committee in the House. And the select committee will be on our response and our rebuilding to the coronavirus. The select committee will look at 3 different areas. One, it will look at the pandemic more broadly. What is happening? This is a pretty new event. It's kind of on the scale of a world war. And so we will examine the kind of bigger issues about how a pandemic moves through a society and the way that people react to that. We'll take a look at what we have done so far at the state, federal, executive, and legislative branch. And we'll take a look at what else should we do. Because this is such a new set of circumstances, there really is no playbook. It's not entirely clear what the work is that the legislature should be doing, what the work of the executive branch. I think we're all looking each day at what needs to be done. And we're jumping in just like in a time of a natural disaster and doing what needs to be done. But we need to take a step back and kind of look more broadly at the role that the legislature can play. Second, we'll be looking at workplace safety and workers' rights. This is sort of a new era in workplace safety. And so it's important that we look to see whether we need to update any of our laws, to address workplace safety. We know our essential workers don't really have any choice. Our grocery store workers are out there on the front lines. We know our nurses are battling tough conditions every day, our doctors. And so we're going to take a look at what we need to do to ensure workplace safety. And then third, we need to look at societal change more broadly. So for example, our school districts, what will school look like in the fall? Will there be an A-B schedule? How are we going to remake some of our classic institutions in light of the pandemic? Some of that is school district work, some of it is Minnesota Department of Education, some of that is legislative. So the goal of the select committee would be with issues like that to sort out where it is that we can make the most difference. What's important is that members will contribute to the work of the select committee. They will, with their efforts, bring forward and share concerns that they think we need to dive more deeply into. So for example, Dave List-Thagard will help us explore the impact on the Iron Range. Chair Paul Marquardt, Tax Chair Paul Marquardt will talk about what it's like to be in a border community and dealing with the different standards that are in place in North Dakota and Minnesota. So we'll give an opportunity for different members to bring different issues forward in the select committee. The select committee will have me as its chair, and it will have the majority leader and the finance chair, Lyndon Carlson. It will also have the minority leader and the finance lead or their designees. And then it will be different members each hearing. It will be 3 majority and 2 minority members, depending upon the topic that we're diving into. We expect that the first committee hearing will be on working conditions for nurses, and that will be the week of May 18th. And with that, I would turn it over to the Majority Leader.
The speaker's comments really demonstrate the degree to which our political system, our state government, has to adapt to this new situation with the pandemic. The scale of issues that we have to address as we close this legislative session is far beyond what we would typically do in a non-budget year. The bonding bill is, of course, important on its own, but it's going to be critically important in the next 6 months, 9 months, or a year. Construction workers right now are employed and the industry is strong, but the pipeline for new projects is drying up. And so we need a strong bonding bill in order to be able to keep our recovery going 9 months from now, if we are fortunate enough to have one, and not have that sector be a drag on the state economy. We have to consider the issues that this select committee will review and try to make sure that there is public comment and accountability for decisions that Minnesota institutions are making, so that we are being thoughtful and looking as far ahead as we possibly can. And we need to resolve the outstanding budget issues that are in front of us this session as well. So this would be a lot of work in any session if we were doing one of these things, and to handle them all at the same time, I think is an unprecedented, put an unprecedented level of demand on the legislature. And I think it really calls for our very best. It calls on us to be putting aside politics as usual, putting aside business as usual, and stepping up to the plate and really examining how we need to act in response to the scale of this crisis. And so I think the select committee is an important step forward to allow us to be more thoughtful and broaden our approach beyond our typical committee schedule. And we do need to get work done by May 18th when we adjourn. I don't think it will be easier as time goes on to address these issues. So there is a level of urgency and a real test for Minnesota's political system to see if we can start to grapple with the scale of this situation.
All right, and our first question is Mary LaHammer, who wants to ask it on camera.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask you about the bonding bill. We went to many, many cities, saw lots of requests. The chair was talking $3 billion at one point. What's the final number? What's in, what's out generally?
You know, I should have that entirely at my fingertips, but I know that her GO number is $2 billion. There's also a component of trunk highway bonding. I believe she has $102 million in trunk highway bonding, and I believe somewhere around $214 million in housing investment bonds. So that bill brief is something that we can release today, so you have all the details. Chair Murphy is presenting that in Ways and Means right now. And as you know, her original desire was to have a much bigger bill. And the reason is that there is such significant unmet need. And as the members of the committee expressed in the committee, it's our job as state leaders to really listen to the local city and county governments who come forward and say, these are projects that are essential for our communities. Please give us the bonding authority to do them. And so it's kind of a partnership. And when we fall down on that job, then the impact hits the communities, right? And so for us to step up to our end of the bargain and take care of the unmet needs is really important. Now, Chair Murphy, although she would love to do a much bigger bill, recognizes the political reality of the moment, and that Senate Republicans and House Republicans are unwilling to meet the unmet needs out there. So it's a dramatically scaled down bill.
So what are your hopes, if I can follow up? What is the likelihood that this bonding bill gets done yet this week or weekend? Not a lot of time left.
Well, I would think that we could get it done, but in order to get work done, you need willing parties and you need people who are willing to reach a compromise. If you have somebody who has at the outset decided that they are completely unwilling to compromise, then there is nothing that you can do to reach a compromise. You have to be creative to go around that particular individual. But
and that individual plan. Is, if I can jump in,
the minority leader.
Talking about individual, are you going to name that individual?
No, so it's our plan to bring this bonding bill to the House floor for a vote this week. And we continue to have a lot of conversations at the leadership level. So You know, the majority leader and the minority leader and I were on with our finance leads last night until I don't know 9:30, talking about the deficit and looking at the different concerns. Now, the minority leader has brought up two legitimate concerns that I believe are sincere. One, what is the legislative role in this peacetime emergency? That's a totally legitimate question. And two, what are we going to do about the deficit? We can't just leave on May 18th and pretend that we don't have this $2.4 billion deficit that we're dealing with. Those are issues I am happy to engage with the minority leader on. And that is part of the reason for the select committee, is to give an opportunity for us to discuss executive orders that the legislature is interested in, for us to explore those areas where the legislature can add value, because we can act quickly enough to benefit Minnesotans, where it's properly a legislative activity and not an executive function in a time of an emergency. So to the extent that Leader Doubt would like to lean in and be part of solving problems, we have created this opportunity for him and for all members to avail themselves of it. His second concern about the deficit is also legitimate, and we are exploring what we can do in the very short amount of time between the May 5th change in the budget projections and the May 18th adjournment to be responsible and serious and address those concerns about the deficit. So as long as we're dealing with sincere policy-based concerns, we can negotiate around that. We can work with that. If what we're looking at is turning the peacetime emergency into a political tool and taking out one's frustration on the coronavirus against the chief executive of the state for political gain, whether that's fundraising or a campaign strategy, that's not something we can negotiate with.
All right. I think you answered most of Esme Murphy's question, but her last part was, is the governor on board with the House proposal?
Our proposal is very similar to the governor's proposal. The boundaries that I gave the chair was to match the governor's numbers in GO and housing and trunk highway. And it is my understanding that Chair Murphy has been in constant communication with MMB Commissioner Myron Franz. And so I would imagine that they would like our bill quite a bit, but there's still time to make adjustments before floor action.
All right. Steve Karnowski asked, I think you've probably addressed most of this, but if there's anything else to add, but with the bonding bill, how do you plan to address the minority leader's threat to block it unless the governor gives up his emergency powers? I think you've addressed that.
Perhaps the majority leader has something to say on that topic if he would like.
It just seems like it's typical end of legislative session political gamesmanship at a time when we really can't afford it. And so we, in forming the select committee, will create an opportunity to review the governor's actions. Republicans will have that opportunity. We don't really have a roadmap for how to end a peacetime emergency in the time of a pandemic, and we don't know the course of this disease. So to say we can't pass a construction bill until a future date, and which we don't know when it will be or how it will occur, no matter how much we might want to, just puts a blocker in the way of construction and projects all around the state that are vital to our economic recovery. So it's really just, to me, irresponsible to take that approach. And I hope that we can resolve that and move forward together in the next week, because there are a lot of people out there waiting and hoping to find out whether there are going to be jobs in 9 months or 10 months or a year. And the longer we delay and the more games we play, we're doing a disservice to people all over Minnesota.
All right, next question is from Jesse Van Berkel. The Senate will vote today on a plan to distribute $667 million in federal COVID aid to local governments on a per capita basis. How will your plan for distributing those funds differ from the Senate proposal?
Well, Representative Paul Marquardt from Dilworth has put together a really phenomenal proposal. I know that the final sandpapering is happening this afternoon, and we expect that bill to be introduced tomorrow and heard in Ways and Means on Thursday. And I think that Chair Marquardt will have a lot to say about that, but he and I went over the contents of the bill this morning, and I would say he's put together a fantastic proposal that's fair across the state.
Next question, also from Jesse Van Berkel. At this point, are you operating under the assumption that Governor Walz will extend the state of peacetime emergency?
I do expect that when you look at the modeling that has been done and you look at the progression of this disease around the country, it's clear that Minnesota has not reached the peak of its surge yet, and our cases are increasing. We also have some really significant emergency issues that the governor and his administration are dealing with in long-term care and in meatpacking. So I would expect that the long-term emergency will continue. And we in the Minnesota House recognize what Minnesotans recognize, which is the governor and his administration are doing a phenomenal job managing this emergency. And since he has had those peacetime emergency powers activated since March 13th, he's done a number of things at a level of speed that the legislature doesn't have in it. And so this is why I think that KSTP poll showed that he had 82% approval and 76% approval of the stay-at-home order. There's still a significant emergency facing the state, and my expectation would be that the emergency would continue.
Okay, Peter Callahan has a question he'd like to ask.
I'd like to get back to that issue of distributing CARES Act money to local governments. The Senate bill had a dispute yesterday as to how it is distributed. DFLers thought it treated big counties and big cities unfairly. What happens if the legislature does nothing on that issue? Is it correct to say that the governor has the authority to distribute some of it as he wishes, and he obviously has the money because the CARES Act money is in the state treasury? And is that the end game, that really you can't agree on how to distribute it and you just leave it to the governor?
Well, what I would say is I think that Senator Rosen's bill is a negotiating position and is an extreme position that she's taken to begin the negotiations. With regard to the governor's power to distribute the CARES Act, there are aspects of it that require legislative action. There are aspects of it that did not require legislative action. Essentially, in terms of negotiating, the governor right now holds a full house. He doesn't need the legislature to do anything. I don't know if the majority leader unmuted himself, so I suspect he would like to say something about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fallback or the default position is that if the legislature doesn't make itself relevant by coming to an agreement on a range of issues, the governor will be the one deciding how the CARES Act will be funded. The governor will decide whether the reserve will be employed to balance the budget. The governor will decide if an allotment is necessary down the road. All of these authorities have been provided to the governor by the legislature in the past. And so the legislature, as throughout this crisis, is as relevant as it makes itself. And so Republicans, whether they are in the majority in the Senate or in the minority in the House, have to come to the table sincerely willing to negotiate and make compromises, or they will not have a say in this, and neither will we, frankly. And so I think it would be to their benefit and everyone's benefit if the legislature would make itself relevant by coming to an agreement and compromising.
And the key there is to take reasonable positions. The federal funding, allocating the federal funding is a train that's leaving the station. If the legislature wants to be part of driving that train, it needs to be reasonable in its expectations and demands on the executive. And if, to the extent that the legislature is not reasonable and makes unreasonable demands about how that money should be allocated, the governor has all the authority he needs to spend it the way he chooses.
Well, if I can follow up, then why would he cooperate in a bill? I mean, why is he even dealing with y'all if he can do what he wants regardless? Why give an inch?
Well, as a 14-year member of Congress, he has a healthy respect for the legislative branch. And I also think that the executive branch as well is struggling with where is the line between what is required to be executive action at this point in time and what is required to be legislative. And I think to some extent, the legislative process is a good way to come up with solutions of how to deal with problems. It also, though, has that detriment of being slow. So it's very inclusive. It's a process that's contemplative, that takes into account a lot of viewpoints, but it is slow. And so he's, I'm sure, balancing his continued relationship with the legislature and the value that we can add and the value to Minnesotans of reaching a deal with Republicans and getting things done in an orderly fashion with the power that he has to proceed unilaterally on the federal funding. And let's be clear, well, the majority leader made this point on the floor yesterday, is the governor's authority, well, and the day before that, the governor's authority to spend the federal dollars arises from a statute that the legislature enacted.
All All right. Theo Keith has a question on non-COVID bills. Any deal on tobacco 21 or third-party driver's tests?
There is a deal on tobacco 21. My general rule for the floor is that we're not taking up legislation unless it's likely to become law, except for a few exceptions. And T21 is my understanding that Representative Heather Edelson and Senator Carla Nelson had full agreement on the language before the House passed that bill. In fact, I think that one's on the way to the governor's desk. I think I signed that one at the rostrum yesterday. And the second question was?
Third-party driver's tests.
I will have to look into that.
All right, and I think this ought to be the last question here from Esme. Given the gulf between your position and that of the minority leader, isn't it likely there won't be a bonding bill this year? And what would the impact of that be?
Well, I would say that each and every state representative has a responsibility to serve the constituents of their district and the people of Minnesota. And so I think the bonding conversation is one that involves every single member of the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate.
And the answer to the question is it's up to the minority Republicans on whether there's a bonding bill or not, or whether they want to hold out for an unreasonable role in deciding how to manage the pandemic and making the governor commit to something that he doesn't have the information or ability to commit to at this time.
All right, there's one last question from Jesse Van Berkel. This will be last question. Could the legislature deal with state worker contracts or the bonding bill in June? Are there additional complications that come with a delay?
There aren't really complications that come with dealing with a bonding bill in June, except for the lack of certainty for the communities in Minnesota. And we're there now. We have a deal within sight if people are willing to be reasonable. So there's no reason not to do it now. With regard to the state worker contracts, current state law requires that those contracts are approved up or down by May 18th, or they revert to contracts that were in place before, which would mean an immediate pay cut for the state employees that are covered, and complete chaos with regard to health insurance, because they dramatically changed the deal for their health insurance coverage, with employees contributing more and the state contributing less. And so failure to take action on the state contracts by the May 18th deadline is highly detrimental.
Okay, we'll wrap up there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.